Good morning, Randall, and thanks for having me again on the show. Yes, I'm Professor Paul Frijters. I've been an academic most of my life, and I'm a professor of economics, and I'm here to talk about the aftermath of all the COVID authoritarianism and what the future might look like.
Lovely. So I'm a big fan of yours. I had you on last time. We talked about your variation of QALY, which is quality adjusted life years. I don't want to go over that again. I'll put a link to it. But what have you been working on in the meantime? And what do you mean by kind of the situation we have with the resistance?
Well, I've been working on various things. I've been working on, as we're standard academic staff, teaching students about well-being and about governance in order to keep the bills paid, as it were. Meanwhile, resistance-wise, I've mainly been writing with co-authors of mine in Australia and Thailand about what we could do to improve our institutions once sanity returns to those institutions, as it were, reform ideas once a large majority is convinced that things are very bad and we really need to change something. And we've worked on that in various areas. We've worked on that when it comes to media. We've worked on that when it comes to the civil service as a whole. We've worked on that when it comes to what we ourselves can do the coming 10 years. We've worked on that when it comes to how to deal with charities, how to deal with huge inequality, how to deal with taxation. And so we've sort of tried to assemble as best we can with quite a few different co-authors, a whole set of possible reforms that we can go through in the West in a far, far future.
All right, so let's just structure. What is the problem? What was the problem exhibited? You mentioned authoritarianism. What was the problem exhibited during COVID? Was COVID just a sign of other issues, or was it a kind of a black swan, or an oddity?
Well, I think that COVID, as it were, itself started out with a huge panic that was unintended, that was sort of a surprise, but that was extremely quickly put upon by opportunists in government, corporations, and politics for their own agendas. And so it very quickly went from what was, as it were, a panic that went via social media, that was fanned by governments for all kinds of reasons, but then got a life of its own, a huge panic. But then governments, corporations, and other entities jumped on it in order to make money, expand their power, keep populations terrified. And so then, as it were, a huge authoritarian beast emerged. Now, part of that beast had already been, as it were, under construction for a long time. So in some sense, the panic just allowed a monster to come out of the shadows that was already building and forming, but that we hadn't yet quite seen before so clearly, and that now is sort of, a recognized problem by pretty much everybody in the resistance, coming from all kinds of political traditions. And so now the question is, okay, what do we do? Right? And of course, there's lots of people who are still going over the history of how that sort of authoritarian monster emerged and the forces that make it up, which include the mass media, the top Western politicians, big pharma, the big tech executives, most of us were the super rich class, but also a lot of us were the globalist elites. And that's been sort of well recognized. We sort of know their game in some sense, and how they've been forming and what their ideologies look like. But now, of course, the question is, well, what do we do? How do we organize ourselves as a resistance? Where's the hope? And also, what in the long run is the way to prevent a recurrence, to sort of reform our societies to go back to better times? And better times would have been, 20 years ago, but even 5 years ago, life was much better. Average life expectancy in the US was 2 years higher before the pandemic. So, we don't need to go back far to say, well, then already life was a lot better than it is now.
No, I agree. I call it the before times. I see so many signs that I don't know. It's kind of an odd thing. There are people who just seem to kind of carry on with it. I hang out with various groups and social functions, from my athletic clubs to an investment club to my religious congregation. And in one of them, there's an MD PhD, excuse me, an MD, MPH. So he's an MD and a Master of Public Health. And he won't hang around for the luncheons. And he wears a mask during the actual function. And it's 2023. There's kind of an odd solidarity, it seems, amongst and he's, I would assume, kind of an elite and a decision maker on the public health establishment. So there are long periods of time we don't think at all about the public health establishment, the WHO, the CDC, or various organizations, whichever country you happen to be in. But there's been, in a sense, a taking over by these they're bureaucracies, and they can be international bureaucracies in the case of WHO. When did this happen? And is this the case of the tail wagging the dog, or was the tail always the stronger part of the dog?
These a lot of very important questions, Randall. I don't think we quite know all the answers to that, but I think it is clear that, as it were, what I'm now calling the globalist class, and I'm thinking of that as a Western globalist class, not really international, because I think that the Western globalists have sort of been found out and are being abandoned, left, right, and center in the world of today by Latin American countries, the Middle East, the alliance of China, India, and Russia. So really, it's sort of a Western global alliance, if you like. But of course, they were already extremely powerful and growing in power the last 20 years. So a person called David Rothkopf in 2008 published a book called The Superclass, and he already told of the tens of thousands of super rich or otherwise, as it were, elite globalists meeting in Davos, but also meeting elsewhere in the UN and meeting in other international institutions, and sort of forming a class of their own that sort of felt superior to countries, that didn't feel that they were beholden to national populations, but sort of felt that they were running the world, and they were sort of telling each other how marvelous they were and how stupid everybody else was, and that everybody else sort of needed to do what they thought was good for them. And so a class emerged of people thinking themselves superior, dreaming of running the world, and even of dreaming of sort of better humans and totally different institutions, and hence in some sense the overthrow of nation states. But I think that as it were, the COVID period almost coached out that monster. It made it grow. It made a lot of money for big pharma. It really accentuated the power of the big tech companies. It made these huge online businesses bigger at the expense of lots of local shops who just couldn't compete with online delivery models. And so it made the monster stronger, if you like, but it also coached it out. It brought it out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
It started to overplay its hand with all the mask mandates, the forced vaccinations, the travel bans, the lockdowns, the sort of the nonsense censorship stories. And so more and more people came to see, oh my God, there was this sort of enormous group of elites, and they all seem to be saying the same in different countries in the West, but not everywhere in the world. I mean, they really have been found out. And so what you now find, in March 2023 is quite extraordinary in terms of the resistance, our side. I mean, our side now includes people like myself who are a little bit sort of, left of center, who are still working with governments in 2019. And I find myself on the same side of people who've been strongly Christian their whole lives, who sort of lived separate from a lot of the rest of society, but also with libertarians, classic liberals, lots of real conservatives in there. It's sort of a quite motley crew of people. And we look around and we find we agree on almost everything. And in fact, that all the things we used to disagree on, well, we still disagree on those, but they've shrunk into insignificance. It's as if the distance that was there between us, that sort of used to look big, now looks like 1 centimeter compared to the kilometers that we are now all separated from, as it were, the shenanigans that the globalist class has foisted upon us. So that's quite heartening, I find, right? And a lot of interesting conversations in that sense are taking place, and a lot of tolerance is emerging. I'm now find myself unbothered, and other people are unbothered by what I think that 5 years ago would have left us all fighting.
No,
And
it's an
so
interesting.
that's a very interesting time, Randall.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt because you're on an interesting point, but I'm thinking back to I'm Jewish, and I read a lot on the aspects of the Holocaust, and they're all to call people Jews is kind of amongst the Jews there's many jokes. Um, there's one joke. It's like, oh, this is a very tiny town. There's 3 synagogues, only 2 Jews. It's like, says I go to that one. He goes to that one. He says, well, what's the third synagogue? I said, oh, that's the one nobody goes to. But there's always been, within, there were Jews who were, economically adept, running, stores and whatnot, and commerce and whatnot. And then there's also leftists, and then there's small town, whatever. And there was a lot of internecine fighting, and amongst my grandparent era, there was a lot of bickering. People like my parents, had a mixed marriage. They're both Jewish, but my dad came from kind of more shtetl, small town Russia, and my mom's family they were from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were kind of wealthier and upper class. There's all these divisions. So, but then Hitler came along, etc., and everybody was a Jew. Everyone kind of got dumped into this one thing. And when they were in the concentration camps, it didn't really so much matter what their left, right, high class, low class. Everyone was that thing. And so what you're talking about is, in a sense, kind of like the oppressor bringing together the oppressed. And it's like everybody winds up hurting the same way. Everyone feels pain the same way. And when you do, you have to kind of figure out a way to get out of that. And you wind up having allies. I mean, I'm not trying to make the situation analogous, because I think there's always, too much, of Godwin's law where everything's Hitler. I'm not saying that, but, clearly lockdowns, exhibited a threat and an imprisonment, in a sense, that had never happened before. As one quick sideline, my next topic perhaps to write about is the history of lockdowns in public health, and frankly, there isn't one. I've been looking. There was in Sierra Leone in 2013 or something. There was a lockdown of a small area because of Ebola, and in 2014 in South Africa they locked down the Pearson Hospital for tuberculosis, but it was already kind of a closed facility, and so forth. But there are very few lockdowns, I think, in the history of mankind ever. And so here's the question. Sorry about the diversion, but the question is, economically or whatever, where did this concept of lockdown come across? And since we're all kind of been locked down, was it an effective public health measure, and how did it play out economically? And what are the fights against those kinds of overreach?
Oh my God. Geez, that's a lot of brackets opening, though.
Yeah, sorry. That's how I roll.
I'm not an historian of medical history, but I do understand that, as it were, the lockdowns, as they've been instituted in the US and in Europe, were just a carbon copy of what the Chinese did. So yes, there were sort of, some people who were sort of dreaming of somehow separating society into all kinds of separate groups, but that was sort of never truly implemented or was sort of even thought of in the extreme way that the Chinese did it. So the lockdowns, as we've now come to know it, are a Chinese invention and then copied by everybody else, partly because all these health bureaucrats thought, oh, this looks rather marvelous, and they sort of believed the Chinese that this was successful. But of course, the health bureaucrats also thought, well, this is a lot of power. And it sort of also fit a little bit the type of models that they were running then. And the type of models that they had sort of very simplistic assumptions in them. And one of them is that it's sort of possible to tell people to do nothing for months and not meet each other, and thereby prevent them from sort of exchanging viruses and bacteria and whatnot. But of course, the reality of modern life is that it's actually not possible. So the key thing to say about lockdowns is that they were a gigantic failure on their own terms, because you can't keep people separate. I mean, they would starve, right? Somebody needs to come down to change the electricity, to sort of keep the water running. And of course, lots of people have got to sort of run around and keep the shops occupied, keep the power stations running, go to the hospitals. And if you think
about food, I mean, I most every day I wind up eating.
Exactly. And here's the other thing about lockdowns. I mean, lockdowns they almost force the worst kind of congregation to happen, which is, of course, that you can tell people they shouldn't leave their home, but what if they're very sick? Well, they got to go to the hospital. They got to go to the doctor. And who are they going to meet there? They're going to meet the other sick people, namely, all the COVID sufferers and that. You can put 20 masks on them, but of course, they don't help at all with these extremely small virus particles. So you're basically putting exactly the people who are most vulnerable in vicinity of the people who are most likely to be infectious. And so these hospitals then turn into COVID distribution centers. And then wherever you send these people back to, they're going to infect exactly the wrong people, because who do, as it were, old, unhealthy people live with? Other old, unhealthy people, right? So you're sort of setting yourself up as a government and a medical sector to be itself the most efficient distributor anyway. And so it very quickly morphed into a kind of a theater in which the only people who were truly separated from others were the healthy part of the population. You made them less healthy by sort of keeping them from being outside, from exercising, eating well, from socializing with others. So you gradually reduce their health, their sort of immune fitness, their ability to withstand all kinds of diseases. You're crashing the economy. You're preventing real protection and real health around the people who would need it most. And of course, you're enabling this kind of huge authoritarianism. And so, it's sort of madness in all kinds of ways. And it was recognized to be madness, of course, by the pandemic plans pre-2020, when it was just a consensus of over 100 years that one should never do something as stupid as lockdowns. But the China example just convinced a lot of health bureaucrats in the West that, oh no, we can do this, and isn't it bloody marvelous that we can be at the buttons of the whole of society and sort of pretend to be its saviors? And then, of course, you very quickly got all kinds of commercial interests going. The vaccine pushers saw an opportunity to sell their vaccines to the entire world population. And then, of course, the mask distributors and producers sort of see a chance. And there's a chance to all the people who are involved in all this online delivery and online stuff, because they can then outmuscle all the local shops, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So you get this emerging coalition of businesses, particularly very large businesses, who basically benefit from this. And then, of course, you've got all the theater of sort of trying to cover up all your mistakes, which happened very quickly, because, of course, it very quickly became clear to governments that they stuffed up in 101 ways. And well, how do you prevent the population from being angry at you? Well, you double down and you censor science and reasoned thought that says that you stuffed up. And so you then sort of activate this huge censorious machine. And of course, because the security services were very quickly involved in all of this, they knew how to do that. And so they then formed another coalition, particularly with big tech, to sort of institutionalize censorship in a way we've never seen before. So the West has now got a kind of an operating ministry of Western propaganda going, to sort of, keep pretending that the vaccines are useful rather than detrimental to the health of large parts of the population. Keep pretending that the lockdown saved lives rather than cost a lot of lives. Keep pretending that school closures were not bad, even though lots of international organizations very quickly said, oh no, don't do this. You're sort of, throwing a whole generation of children under the bus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's been extraordinary to sort of watch this train wreck unfold. And you can sort of understand each and every decision, for local political reasons and ass covering and whatnot. Man, from sort of looking from afar, it's just astonishing how much damage the West has done to itself, and the kind of strange situation we now find ourselves in, with these globalist class having been coached out and sort of, criminalized itself so much that they can't really go back. And so now they really have to try and sort of make a Western empire of it, lest they're sort of found out and hounded by their own populations. So that's the situation we now find ourselves in. A minority has realized what goes on, and they must now, as it were, try to figure out their own personal way, and hopefully also help others find a way out of this darkness and towards a Western reform movement.
Right. So that's an excellent exegesis. So I think you're hinting at, the next phase, which is, how does the resistance? I mean, I eventually, Charles de Gaulle, took over France, and my understanding is, he was part of the resistance. He was part of the Free French and so forth. And so there are instances, for better, for worse. I mean, Pol Pot, I think, was also forming, sort of resistance against the erstwhile Cambodian government. So not every resistance fighter is, winds up with a better system. But let's stipulate, whether you're a Gaullist or not, that we're going to maybe aim for, something close to the Charles de Gaulle model, where we come up with a better concept for France than Nazi Germany had. Getting back to our Godwin's law. So what is the resistance? What's the manifestation of the resistance, and against what are we resisting?
Well, the resistance is different in the many countries that I look at. I like what is now happening in the US, which we're talking about, and I like what's happening now in the Netherlands. I'm a bit dismayed about the supposed resistance in the UK. And I'm also quite involved in the resistance in Australia, where it's really very early days yet, where the majority of the population is still fully in line with everything that's happened. But if we think about the resistance, then it's a motley crew. There are lots of different groups doing lots of different things. And so what you, for instance, have is people who are just resisting as families. They've sort of opted out of the local schools because they're afraid of losing their kids to the woke ideology that is now being inflicted on their children. And I think part of the reason the woke ideology is pushed so hard by big interests is because it's a divide and rule ideology. It makes everybody the enemy of everybody else. And so that helps, of course, the powers that be. But there's resistance by families. There's also a resistance by small communities who are opting out of the mainstream health systems and thinking to themselves, you know what, we can do this better. They're sort of opting out of the monetary systems. They're opting out of the mainstream political system, setting up their own political parties, or just organizing locally in terms of councils or states. And of course, the standout examples of that in the US are Florida, Texas, but also South Dakota, of course, is a very early mover away from as it were, the mainstream model. And that's really growing in the US now. So the main hope must be that the US turns around before anybody else turns around. But you have, as it were, similar movements in the Netherlands. And there again, lots of different groups. You have groups setting up their own education system. You have groups demonstrating. You have groups just meeting all over the country for coffee. You have groups who are protesting by putting up the flags upside down. You have groups who are trying to forge coalitions with lots of people who are in various ways and for different reasons also belittled by the globalist class. That could be the farmers who are being belittled, or it could be lots of small businesses who've lost their livelihoods, or it could be the victims of the vaccine damage, or it could be the people who are sort of being ousted because of the energy bills that are sort of driven by, as it were, extreme climate ideology, etc., etc. So the resistance is in that sense a very loose network, and they cooperate better in some countries than in other countries. But I would say their personal agenda is often to, as it were, to escape the extreme pain that governments or their own communities are trying to foster upon them, trying to make a better lives for themselves, their families, and the groups they care about. Mm-hmm. And the long run aim is, of course, to sort of bring back their countries, or at least a large part of their community, to some notion of sanity, so that it's a livable place again. And for some people in the resistance, that means just moving somewhere else, right? Sort of giving up on the communities they were part of. So, moving away out of New York and Boston and go and live somewhere sane, or at least somewhere more sane at that moment. So moving to Miami or somewhere else. And so you see all those kind of things. And of course, you then get that within the resistance, there are all kinds of roles being taken up. One of the main roles has been just information provision, pushing back against all the medical nonsense that the mainstream is saying, pushing back against all forms of sort of extreme emergency stories as to the climate emergency or the energy emergency. And others are trying to sort of look ahead and sort of think, okay, where's this going? Where does the long run hope lie? What should we organize? What can we do as communities? And different countries are at different phases of that last part.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a lot of excellent points there. One theme that I was listening or hearing while you were speaking is emergency. I think there's a miscategorization of emergency, and I think emergency, much like your point about dividing and conquering the internal populace, is a way of having power. I mean, in a fire alarm, there's no cogitation. The fire alarm sounds, you run out for the exits, because that you're under the assumption. I mean, there's a chance it's a false alarm, but either way, your kind of Pascal's wager is that the best situation is for you to act as if it's real, because and the chance it's real, that's so far more dangerous than you're ignoring. Anyway, you're more likely to be damaged by your negative response to an actual event. Anyway, but it seems that most of these things have in common their sense of emergency. And everything gets presented, and I think it's probably more from the left than the right, as a feeling moment, that we feel this is a problem, and we lose sense of magnitude. And I think you have had it presented, from what I've seen, the same voice in quantitating these different emergencies. I mean, recently in the U.S. there was a whole brouhaha about gas stoves, that they were causing some problem, and people having asthma and so forth. And I think this is minuscule. It's like, but nonetheless, it was all taken up, and our town, my beautiful bucolic near suburb, they have a plan to make sure of this and make sure of that, and have no new gas hookups to houses and so forth. I'm sure the fireplaces are the next to go, and there's a kind of a willful ignorance or pushing aside of any rationality, scale perspective. So where's the question here? You can either take that up and run, but what's the court of sanity? On whom can we depend for adjudication of these various emergencies when people in general are bombarded by one after another?
I think that's an interesting question, and I totally agree with you that emergencies are now the new divide and rule. But of course, they're also the old divide and rule. Right? Machiavelli already said that a politician must skillfully use fear, because fear is always a winner from a political perspective. You can really count on fear, and you can manipulate people easily through fear. It's kind of like a recipe that's well trodden, well known, and very dependable. Whereas other things are less dependable. So we've seen that. Giorgio Agamben in Italy has written on that famously for a long time. He wrote a book in 2003 already analyzing the aftermath of 9/11 as sort of, giving an emergency excuse for all kinds of mission creep from the government and the security services to sort of expand their power at the expense of everybody else. And of course, every time you go through these kind of, huge security queues at the airport, you should be reminded that, oh, yes, we're sort of still pretending that is a huge problem, and that these kind of X-rays machines really help, and that is keeping us safe. No, it's not, but it's keeping a lot of sellers of X-rays machines very rich. Thank you very much. And similarly with the gas stuff, right? I mean, gas is one of the cleanest forms of energy we have from an environmental point of view. But of course, if you sort of do away with all your gas appliances, and replace that by, let's say, electrical appliances, well, then of course the seller of those electrical appliances is jumping up and down with joy, and will fan the propaganda that says, oh, gas is bad, my appliances are good. But of course, you just move the problem of energy production to wherever the power plant is that produces the electricity. So I totally agree with you that all the emergency stuff is as it were the political train having run away from itself. If we then think of, okay, did I at the sort of the start of the lockdown start to calculate stuff? Yes, we very quickly saw that the anxiety and the mental health loss was something like 10% of what makes life worthwhile. We've now seen that there's sort of huge losses in terms of the quality of the health system. So lots of people got cancer, lots of IVF treatments were cancelled. With the vaccines, there's now increasing evidence of lots of people losing their babies, of lots of people sort of having a compromised immune system. So lots of tumors and other things grow more quickly. And so the net health effects for large parts of the population now look to be tremendously negative. And of course, the long run effects of the economic collapse mean that government and other institutions have less to spend on education, all kinds of other things. And the school disruptions are coming home to roost, and will certainly mean that there's a whole generation who is less smart and less rich than their parents. So there's not much doubt that this has been a huge own goal, but of course the question remains, how are we going to escape from this? What are we going to do as individuals and communities, and what should we do as countries to get back to sanity? Now, you asked basically, well, where's the people we can trust? And I think it's very important to say the answer is no one. You should not bring up, not even me, you should not put up anybody as the new authority who will have the truth. That's exactly the problem. As soon as you do that, no matter whom it is, that person will become co-opted, their status and their ego will run away with themselves, they'll become part of the problem. That's not how science works, and that's not how communities can recover. Communities must be made up of different perspectives. They must, in that sense, each person must themselves become interested again in having their own view of what the truth is. And they won't be perfect, they won't be right, they'll disagree with others. But if they have a similar interest, then they will start to agree on lots of important stuff. And I think we've seen a beautiful example of that, and we discussed it earlier, that people from many different walks of life have really come to exactly the same conclusion as to what's wrong nowadays. They've seen this globalist class emerge, and they've sort of seen the overstretch and the abuse of power of their governments. They've seen the censorious efforts by big tech and by ministries of propaganda in the various countries. They've seen their kids hurt. And they sort of look around and see that they are now in this quite large resistance community where everybody has seen exactly the same thing. And so they didn't need to be told this by one single source of truth. They heard it from hundreds, but also from their own expertise, from what they could see from their own children or their own line of work. They could see, yeah, no, this is happening. And so in a sense, we should put much more trust in people and their communities to be able, if they're willing, to sort of figure out what's roughly true and to sort of, find sources of reason, but find multiple sources of reasons, and then sort of, weed out what is sort of the less likely and less important stuff and come to their own views. We should not say, well, the authority is betrayed us, where's the new authority? That's just running from one dictator to another one.
Right.
So the answer must be none.
Right. So there's a lot of interesting points you have there. It sparked a few thoughts of mine. One is that, I'm not sure exactly how it is today, but for a number of decades in Europe, the best espousers of free markets were, the former Iron Curtain countries of East Europe. And Winston Churchill, I believe, said at one point that the longest socialism is the longest, most painful, arduous road between capitalism and capitalism. And then there's one other. There's just one tiny point. This is a little topical thing that's happening again in my bucolic suburb. I live in Newton, Massachusetts, and we have a vote on the override, which is to give more money. So they raise their taxes every year. They're allowed to raise it 2.5% every year by statute. And they always kind of suck up to that amount. They're even if the rate of inflation, as it had been, was much lower the previous decade, like 1.4%. They're always going as much as they can, and now they need an override over that. And the funny thing is, I'm kind of come to the point here. This is at a time of observed failure of their model. Our schools, we have the same number of kids. The population has been static for a decade or two, but the schools went down 14% in enrollment. So even though we don't pay, it's a sunk cost, we pay taxes, but the schools are free. People have pulled their kids out of the school at an alarm, incredible rate. And it's never been seen before in our bucolic suburb. And to go spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to put their kids in private school just to avoid the public schools. And I think there are two major reasons. One is that the public schools were shut down during COVID. And number two is that the parents got to see on Zoom what they were teaching in the schools, and this divide and conquer stuff. And one class of students being told that they are evil embodiment almost literally, and so they've marched out, and nonetheless, this, I mean, I know Facebook cut their staff by 20%. Apple cut their staff by 20%. I mean, a lot of companies have had down years. Twitter by 50%. But our city has cut by 0%, even though their model has failed. It seems that they don't really quite get the message. We're going to have a vote ostensibly tomorrow, unless there's a huge snowstorm. But so that's a little plug for the No Override Newton committee. But it's even so, it's a very tight vote here. I think there's a good chance we're going to lose this vote because people, to your point, they understand when they've been hit over the head. And to use another quote, I got one more after this, but H.L. Mencken, who was kind of the Mark Twain incarnate a few years later, early 20th century, he said democracy is the system by which people vote for what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. And
I know.
I'm not sure how long it takes for people to get it, and maybe I'm just wrong because I'm getting something that shouldn't be gotten or whatnot. But I'm going to just pop in this quote here to see your thoughts on it. This is my favorite, aside from you, my favorite economist, Sol, and you can read it here. We put decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong, and so we, in a sense, like H.L. Mencken says, we deserve, in a sense, to get it good and hard if we don't make them pay when they don't have to pay. And I've seen this over and over again, throughout our bureaucracies. And this whole concept of bureaucracy is its own problem. And I know you're kind of an expert on this. Maybe we can segue into some of your own work on this topic.
Yeah. Look, those are very important points. And if we're going to go back to points made, I also want to go back to the point of sort of the emergency being akin to a building is on fire supposedly. You head for the exits as a safety precaution. Yeah, I feel the lockdowns were more akin to saying, okay, we think the building is on fire, and so for your safety, please jump out of the window. Just to be sure. That's right. The fire won't consume you. Right. And that is the precautionary principle.
I'm sorry. That's actually so. They say laughter is kind of release of pain. That I think the essence. We laugh, we cry, because laughter and crying are sort of on. It's not like left and right. They're actually part of a circle.
It's a circle.
But laughter is kind of this when you avoid pain, and that is so hugely funny. God.
Isn't it? So, but to come back to bureaucracy, and that is a deep problem, and it is a deep problem for the reason that bureaucracy is eternal. We've had bureaucracies for thousands of years now. The Chinese are sort of said to be the main inventor, and lots of things that we now take for granted in bureaucracies are sort of Chinese derived. There's meritocracy and appointment. You have a standing bureaucracy that looks after staff. You have specializations. You have exams, you have specialized educational institutions, you've got departments, all kinds of things, right? So basically bureaucracy is eternal. And the nasty thing to say in that sense, and that goes a little bit against the quote you just put up, is that bureaucracies in a long run sense have expanded, are kind of successful in the sense that they can do stuff. And also, most big businesses now are also bureaucracies, right? So if people tend to make this mistake of thinking, well, there's the government and then there's this wonderful thing called free enterprise. But you go to, sort of Google and Amazon and all these other large businesses, and it's as if you walk into a government department. There are lots of procedures there. There are lots of sort of different functional units. They keep sending each other updates and position statements. There are sort of diversity programs. They talk of stakeholders. It's kind of like, oh my God, I'm back, right? And so the way that they operate is also extremely similar. So, for instance, the main trick of how government bureaucracies get stuff done is that every large complex problem is chopped into very many small bits, and then they sort of try to glue back the small solutions into solving the big problems. That's exactly how all these large corporations do it as well. So the essential aspect of a bureaucracy, which is that you've got these mindless little small units designated to do a small task. They don't see the damage they do to other tasks, but somehow they do something. And then, what they do gets added up to the activities of all the other small units to somehow make a solution towards a large issue. Well, that describes not just the health bureaucracy, that describes General Motors, that describes Tesla, that describes a pharmaceutical company. And so in that sense, there is no escape from bureaucracy. There is just, how can we do bureaucracy better? How can we, as it were, have a competition between bureaucracies so that, lots of them die regularly enough or sort of get chopped to size, right? And so, but within bureaucracy, this unaccountability is entirely not just normal, it's part of the strength of bureaucracies. They must have unaccountability, because otherwise you can't say to a unit, look, you do this small thing, but don't worry about how it fits into everything else. We'll worry about that. That must be the core way in which you organize something. And so in that sense, yes, the news on bureaucracy is terrible because it's unavoidable. It has won against many other forms of organization. It is there in big business as much as it's there in government. And hence, the long run name of the reform game is not get rid of bureaucracy per se, but just do bureaucracy better, have an ecosystem in which they fight other bureaucracies more, they die more quickly, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I read an article, which I probably can find, but I read it maybe 20 years ago. It was, I like to find silver linings. Maybe I'm just a Pollyanna kind of guy, but the silver lining in this case of Enron, the collapse of Enron, was that it was allowed to collapse. So the article was talking about the malfeasance at Enron, the certain culture of this and that. They were kind of doing a shell game with their money, and so forth and so on, and they were bad. Let's stipulate they did bad acts. Fine. And then he compared it to Amtrak, which is the American, governmental monopoly on commuter trains and so forth, and in intercity transport. And there's all kinds of malfeasance going on in Amtrak, but it can't die. So it becomes the zombie edifice that keeps, has a hunger, but it is not, operating well. And so, other companies learned from the corpse of Enron because it died. And, there's basically the term of art, I guess, in economics is moral hazard, which I don't really like, but there it is. There's kind of a moral hazard when you don't allow it to die. And because it's topical and because you're here, and maybe you may not have full expertise on this topic, but I think there's kind of a moral hazard in what's happened with banks, because banks are in the news, Silicon Valley Bank, and then Signature Bank, and I guess Republic Bank, where, there's failures. And, lo and behold, the U.S. government's going to come in and backstop them. Which is all well and good. I mean, you can have a catcher and you can have a backstop behind the catcher, but you can't backstop everything. Yeah, I guess the movie that won the Academy Awards last night was Everything Everywhere All at Once. To use that phrase, you can't be everywhere and do everything all at once. And you can't backstop everything with just this thing called government, which, what is it anyway? It's backed up with the fact that they can print money, which can go into the money supply, but that has its own obvious cost and inflation. As we've seen, they backstopped COVID, and what I used to have, there's a T-shirt. My parents went to Las Vegas, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. My bureaucrats, did a lockdown. All I got was this lousy inflation, and now we're going to change the emergency to banks, and we're going to get more. Anyway, so you probably can find a question in there, maybe.
No. It's very interesting because I'm teaching here in the Masters of Finance, so I've been teaching my students about some of the stuff that's been going on in the financial markets, and there's so much to say, right? The main point to make about the last couple of years about financial markets is indeed that the government, in a way, has cheated on the money holdings of everybody else by printing a lot more of it. And that sort of, brought them out of trouble in the short run, but in the longer run, it got you inflation. But here's the kicker from an American point of view, which is that, of course, there's almost 30 trillion US dollars in holdings elsewhere in the world. And if there's 10% inflation, then that effectively means a tax on all that of $3 trillion. And so maybe up to half of all this backstopping has just been paid by foreigners. Now, that's a nice little transfer to the US, right? And if you want to make it even more nasty, of course, one of the reasons for that is that so much of the international economy is in dollars. That's why all these foreign banks elsewhere in the world want to have reserves in US dollars and want to have treasury bonds and whatnot. But of course, part of the reason for that is that the American military makes it very hard for lots of governments to truly opt out of that dollarization of their economy. And so in a certain way, the most important part of the American bureaucracy, which is the US Army, which is also a bureaucracy, right? And nobody's saying, well, shouldn't that die, do you? So, there are parts of the American bureaucracy every American patriot wants to keep on going. Well, it's also partly getting you quite a few bucks from the rest of the world.
That's a long-term, short-term problem. I mean,
true.
Little bit.
We are getting sidetracked here to a certain extent, right? But you're right that, as it were, it's good to have, as it were, a form of renewal within government bureaucracies possible. And it is possible. I mean, in the long run, lots of government departments have gone bankrupt or have at least been allowed to die and taken over. And of course, one of the old ways in which bureaucracy dies is that just there was a foreign invader who took over the country as a whole and axed everything about the conquered bureaucracy they didn't like. That was a renewal drive. That certainly happened in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I know that part of your family came from. Their solution to the problems of that bureaucracy was that they lost a war and somebody else took over the place and reformed it. And that historically is not a very abnormal solution to lots of bureaucratic problems. But to sort of make the point on this kind of bureaucracy, shouldn't you sort of let more of them die? Yes, you should. And of course, part of the genius of democracy until recently has been that is partly what you can do as a democratic system. You can sort of figure out, this part of the bureaucracy is not working. Let's privatize it, or let's just stop doing it altogether, or let's totally reorganize it. Now, unfortunately, that has become more and more difficult the last 20 years. There's become more and more, as it were, a single growth of not just bureaucracy, but also large corporations, the media, and the security establishment that has sort of become one voice almost, one mind, one group. And of course, they don't really want to cut in their own flesh, which sort of gets them a big problem because it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And they can't really cut themselves. But then the question is, well, what are they going to tax? Where are the resources going to come from? And they're increasingly running out of resources. And that's, of course, truly when, as it were, the shit will hit the fan and you may get a real reform drive.
So we're rounding towards the end of the hour. And I'm curious, you mentioned the things we can do. And I know you're part of a group in Australia. Maybe you could touch on that. And again, I mentioned in our green room, my grandmother's colorful phrase, which I'll clean up slightly, which is don't let them defecate on your face, open your mouth. And so there's been, my impulse through COVID has been to open my mouth. And I got snapped at in some of my groups when everyone wanted I play tennis. So our squash and tennis club, they closed tennis, outdoor tennis. And when they reopened, they took away the benches and they made us have our own set of tennis balls so that the guy wouldn't touch your tennis balls. Crazy stuff. Anyway, so I sent in notes and letters and tried to rationalize or put into rational perspective the actual threat I mean, we're a bunch of non-smokers who are normal body habitists because we're tennis players. Like ipso facto, there's a selection bias there, no doubt. But you know, the oldsters, maybe a few 80-year-olds and whatnot, fine. They could not play tennis if they chose. But everybody else, like we could play tennis, but no, we couldn't. And so a lot of my voicing this stuff became like, because I was banging my head against this wall, and frankly, they were banging back at me to a large extent. And I said, I got to say something. So I started, doing these solo podcasts and whatnot, and trying to present data and so forth. Anyway, so that's my own personal fight back. I'm not sure how successful I've been, but what's the larger scale? How do we do this, and what's your initiative currently?
So I think the larger scale is that resistance groups have to organize more and more, and the various parts of that resistance, right? So as you know, I'm part of the Brownstone Institute, which I think is a very interesting and important organization run by the great Jeffrey Tucker, who already in January 2020 warned against government overreach. So he was extremely quick on the ball. I only saw it in March 2020. So well done, Jeffrey. And that is sort of has amalgamated a group of thinkers who are trying to look at the problem from very different angles. Also by medics, but also philosophers, economists, psychologists, educators, politicians, former army people, lots of people. So they're basically trying to shine their own individual light on the problem and getting a 360 perspective as to what went on, what is going on, and of course also gazing into the future. And I very much see my role, because I sort of come from the world of how to design bureaucracies, how to design economies, how to think about reforms that are doable, that are practical, that are implementable. That's very much sort of the world I come from and have taught in and have sort of been involved in. I very much see my role with my co-authors to sort of sketch institutional reform. But there are, of course, other roles to be played. And one of the roles is that there's got to be, as it were, a building of these what are called parallel societies, communities doing their own education, doing their own health, doing their own media, doing maybe even perhaps their own small local economy, their own currencies, their own information system as to where you should shop, whom to date, how to find like-minded people. So there's got to be, as it were, a bottom-up growth. And that's where I think lots of exciting things are happening, particularly in the US. There's a lot of homeschoolers who've really, as it were, broken free from the woke stranglehold. There are lots of groups finding each other in resistance to the authoritarianism and realizing there's much more in common than they thought they have. And one of the tasks still to happen, I think, is that there's got to be a little bit of a marrying up of that, as it were, intellectual contribution that is happening of people who used to work at the top of the system, because most Brownstone people sort of used to work at the top of the system. It includes people who are sort of part of building the vaccine systems in the US, like Martin Kulldorff or Jay Bhattacharya, who's sort of one of the top people in public health. And they've got to be married up to some degree to, as it were, all the bottom-up initiatives undertaken throughout the country of sort of small communities trying to escape the oppression. But of course, also in need of sort of both representation and organization. And there needs to be a whole, as it were, middle society formed of, let's say, good accreditation systems for all the homeschooling, good forms of sort of local public health, which are then, private, but go away from the sort of the extreme private health system in the US, which is extremely expensive and sort of has a lot of cracks missing in it. And there, in that sense, is a lot of things to do there.
Well, that's lovely. I'm going to just pop in a few pictures. So this is your Twitter feed, and I commend people to go look at it. You actually retweeted Jeffrey Tucker's retweet of your article. So this is your most recent article in the Brownstone Institute, and people can find it here. How to cut through the new Gordian knots. I do some shameless self-promotion here as well. Fortunately, I am part of the Brownstone coterie, And this is my own article back from December, The Mysterious Case of Zika Microcephaly's Disappearance. And I always like to put in a plug for my book because I can. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. There are a lot of items redolent, or pre-redolent, I guess, for COVID and how there were overreach. I like to tell people I managed to get my self-portrait on the cover of my book. Overturning Zika. You can buy it on Amazon. It's coming out in Brazil in the next couple of weeks by a major publisher there. So I'm looking forward to a rollout there. And so, and your efforts carry on to other aspects. You have a book, The Game of Mates, and I think it goes beyond Australia, of course. Here's a review of your book. I don't know if I put up the Amazon page, but I'm sure it's findable. But here are a number of your works: Game of Mates, Rigged. I think people can kind of find some echo of some of the themes you mentioned today. But this is how favors bleed the nation. And of course, you spelled favors wrong.
My mom was English. It's Her Majesty's English.
No, I know. So I'm going to just say this one thing. We were at a fundraiser for the British School of Boston not because our kids, but my friend's young child goes there, and so we were part of trivia night, and so they had an event. It's a lot of fun. They asked a couple of questions that made sense only for the Brits. One was the longest word in the English language without a vowel, and so frankly, I'm a Scrabble guy, and I've been through this, and it's either TISK, TSK, or nth, the nth degree. Some people think it's, which is a like expression of exasperation, PFFF, PHFFT, or something like that. But they came up with rhythm, and actually they're wrong, mind you, because if you're going to include a Y, it's nymphly. Like her behavior was nymphly. But I said quietly after, the Y is a vowel. It's upsilon from Greek. That's a vowel. It's like, no, Y is a consonant. It's like, no, that's when it's yellow or long.
Let's put it like this: Y doesn't just have, it's not single consonant. It's sort of biconsonant. Right. It's like quantum consonant. It's whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's I'm just teasing about the favor part, but
that's so good.
Getting back to Churchill, he said that I believe he said that the UK and England are two countries separated by common language. That was very much an evidence.
I know. Well, look, I'm on the British side of that particular fence. Thank you very much. With an English mom, I'm afraid on that one I can't help you.
All right. Well, you and I can hang around and chat for a little bit. We'll make everybody else envious. But I'm going to say goodbye to our audience. And do you have any closing words for them?
Yes, I would like to say that I think in the long run sense, the resistance is winning. And it may not always seem that way with all the censorship going around. But of course, the resistance in that sense stands for a new enlightenment. It stands for, dance, song, brotherhood, sisterhood, fraternity. It stands for a return to more democratic notions, for people being deliberative, for raising kids to be optimistic about themselves, critical, oriented towards building up their own notion of truth and what is good in life. And so it's very much a positive story, away from this notion that we should all be afraid of everybody else and we should feel badly about ourselves and sort of know our place in this life as low lives who have to look up to their betters. So in that sense, I think there's just no way that, as it were, our side is going to lose that. I think we are in a historic struggle, but also one in which there can only ever be one winner. That kind of misery cannot win out. It's just unproductive, make people unhappy, unhealthy. And whether or not it's via migration or internal renewal, I do think our side will win. So keep good cheer and enjoy, I would almost say.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you. Those are inspirational words. Thank you, and goodbye.